Most people think that in chess, if a piece is attacked, as long as it's defended, you're good to go. In this example, we can see the bishop's attacking the bishop, but the queen is defending, so white has no problems. Or the queen's attacking the knight, but it's defended by the queen, so white has no problems. However, the issue in this particular example is that the queen is the exact same piece, which is defending both of these pieces. This leads us to a chess tactic known as overloading. What this means is that one piece is overworked and cannot fulfill all of its duties. So in this case, we need the queen to defend the knight, we need the queen to defend the bishop, but the problem you will notice is if black captures that bishop, the queen has to stay here to guard the knight, which means it wasn't really defending the bishop. Or if you say, well, I'll take the bishop, then you lose the knight. This is a very basic example of the overload tactic. I'm going to show you some more intermediate and advanced ones, and we're going to talk through how we can solve these. This is an extremely common and very important tactic, so please make sure you understand this lesson. But having said that, let's get started. All right, so here's another basic example. It's black to play, and using what I already showed you guys, you should be able to figure this one out. What do you think black should play? You had a chance to look at that. The move is bishop takes b5, and the point is that the queen, which was guarding both of those pieces, is overworked, and it has to make a decision. Does it stay guarding the knight, or does it come over here and capture the bishop? And then either way, black is going to win a piece. So that's the very basics. You want to be looking for pieces that are doing too much. Like if you see one of your opponent's pieces that looks like it's doing a lot of different things at the same time, like defending this and defending this and defending this, you might have the possibility for an overload tactic. Let's look at a slightly more advanced example. So it's white to play in this position. What is white's best move? If you had a chance to look at that, white can simply capture the bishop on e7 and pay close attention to black's queen. It's actually overworked here, and if it takes the knight, then you can pick up black's knight over here. Now, an important thing I want to note about this position is it's very important to have good board vision. Okay, when we say board vision, we're talking about paying attention to the entire board. See, some people, when they're thinking in chess, they kind of get caught up in one area of the board. So you might be thinking about this section of the board and you're thinking, well, if I take, black's going to take me and I don't really have anything, you might move on. And then maybe, you're thinking about this section of the board and you're like, okay, well, I could take the knight, but the queen's going to take me. That's not a good move. And, you look at the board in sections, but you forget to put it all together, right? And so this is a good example of how you have to really pay attention to everything at the same time. And that's when you can find this tactic here where you win the knight. All right, let's look at the next example. It's black to play. What should black play in this position? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, remember what I said about looking for pieces that are doing multiple things at the same time. Now, this one's a little tricky because if you're just looking at these three pieces, you won't notice it. But if you look at this pawn is defending the queen, and it's also defending the bishop. And so now that I've said that, you can probably see the idea. We simply take the queen. Of course, white has to take us back if they don't want to lose their queen. But now that pawn is no longer defending the bishop, and we simply take the bishop. Okay, and so you can see how this tactic shows up in a lot of different ways. It's not just with a queen defending pieces. This is an example of a pawn defending pieces. Sometimes it's a rook or a knight or a bishop. And so keep that in mind. If you hear screaming, I do apologize. We have a baby, so sorry about that. All right, let's keep going. Here's the next one. It is black to play, slightly more advanced one, but black to play. If you'd like to pause, what's the best move for black? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, this one is a little bit more complicated, not because the overload tactic itself is complicated, but because the overload tactic is in the middle of a position that has other stuff going on. So let me explain what I mean by that. In this position, our queen is under attack. And so one of the logical moves, and this is the best move, is queen to g3 check. We're going to put the king in check, get out of the attack. And now white has a decision. You could move the king over here, or you could block with the knight. If white blocks with the knight, this is where the overload tactic shows up. And it's very simple, kind of similar to what we've seen. The queen is defending two things at the same time. We are attacking both of those things. And so we simply take the bishop. And if the queen takes, well, then we take here and we win that piece, right? However, if white wanted to, they would have played king to h1. And now we don't really have the same type of overload tactic, because now if we try to take this, white simply takes it, and the bishop is no longer undefended because the knight is still there, right? So you can see how it's not the same tactic available. In this case, the game is going to go a different path, and we would have to continue thinking. I think the best move is actually just to take here and keep going with the attack. But I wanted to show you this example because this is very common in chess, where you're calculating something and there's a couple of different options, and you might have one type of tactic available in one way. So like here you have the overload, but if your opponent does something else, you have to come up with a different plan and figure out what to play in that. So just giving you an example of how that works. All right, let's keep going. Here is another example. It's white to play. What is white's best move in this position? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is simply rook takes f8. And the point here is that we would like to capture this with our queen. And if we do it right now, black's simply going to take us, and then we take, and they move, and we don't really have anything. The game goes on, but black is actually ahead a pawn and, slightly better. However, if we can force the queen away because it's overloaded by taking the rook first, now when this happens, we just have a simple checkmate. This just ends the game. And so black actually can't stop the checkmate if they take our rook, and so they can't take our rook. They have to do something else, and we basically got the rook for free. Okay, so another example of how the queen is overworked, defending too many things, but in kind of a weird way. You might think that, well, we don't need to move the queen away because we can just take that right away. However, this is not nearly as good of a capture as if we can take with our queen and not have to worry about black taking our queen, right? So do you see how it's intertwined with some other stuff going on in the position, but it's the same idea. Queen is overworked. All right, let's keep going. All right, this one's black to play, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you this is a more advanced one, and the overload tactic doesn't happen right away. So don't look for it like immediately. Think about maybe some other logical moves, and then maybe the overload comes at the end. That's kind of your hint for this position. All right, so black to play. What should black play? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the best move for black here is knight to e3 check. Now, if you're familiar with a fork tactic, you maybe saw this, right? Because it is a fork. So you're going to be taking the white queen if white doesn't capture you. So this basically forces white to capture you. And yes, you lose the knight, but what do you get in return? Well, you get a nice attack on white's king. So now we can play queen takes d3 check, and maybe we have a checkmate. And this is how you want to be thinking about these more complicated moves, guys. Like, what do we get by giving up our knight in this situation? Well, we are then able to bring our queen close to white's king, and maybe we can get checkmate, right? So for example, you want to be thinking about something like this. If the king moves over here, and there are only two moves. If the bishop blocks, we just take it, right? That's pretty obvious checkmate. If the king moves here, just checkmate, pretty obvious checkmate, right? So the king has to go here, and we can take back our bishop. So going back to this position, you should be able to say, okay, even though I'm losing my knight, very quickly, 1-2 moves later, I'm going to get it back. And I'm getting a pawn, right? So that's pretty good, and that's the start of this combination. Now, once we get to this position, white's going to block with the knight. And now we have to figure out what do we do. Because at this point, we're still down a piece, right? Like if you check queen for queen, rook for rook, rook for rook, white has an extra knight. So we have to find a good move here. We're going to lose the game probably. So what is the good move here for black? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is rook to a4. And this is another variation or another version of the overload tactic. So I wanted to show you this one because it's very clever. So the queen is currently defending the knight. And you might say, well, that's really all the queen is doing. However, when we play rook to a4, now the queen has another problem, namely that it's being attacked by our rook. And normally the queen would just take our rook if we did something like this. However, in this position, if that happens, now we've got the checkmate because the queen is no longer guarding. So you can see how by playing rook to a4, we are creating a situation where white's queen is overworked. Now it has too many things going on, right? Yes, it can come down here and do a random check. We simply move. And again, the queen is no longer defending the knight, right? So this is a more complicated version of the overload, but it's the same idea, overworking your opponent's pieces to where they can't do everything that they need to do. Okay. All right, let's go. We have a couple more and they are getting more difficult, but this is good practice to see how these overload tactics are intertwined with everything else that's going on in the position. Black to play. What move should black play here? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is simply taking the bishop. And of course, white's going to take back if they don't want to lose their piece. And now we have very similar, but kind of a weird version of what I showed you before. We're creating, by playing rook to d1 check, we're creating a situation where white's rook is overloaded. It's overworked. It wants to stay guarding the queen, but it also wants to take our rook. But it can't take our rook, because if it does, we simply take white's queen. So because of that, we're able to play check basically for free without even worrying about this, which forces white to move their king. And now we have sort of another kind of overload situation in a weird way. We're going to take the queen. And this rook would like to take our queen, obviously, but it also would like to stay here because it's kind of blocking us from taking this guy. You can't choose both, and if you do that, they end up losing the rook over here. So a weird situation, but essentially what it came down to was this rook was overworked, namely that it was protecting the queen and also defending the back rank. And we took advantage of that by coming in because of this idea. Okay, so you can see how this overload idea doesn't look the same in every situation. There's lots of ways that it can play out, and so you really want to be looking carefully that you don't miss these tricky kind of moves. Okay, let's go to the next one. Black to play. What move should black play? All right, well, you had a chance to look at that. The best move is bishop takes g2 check. And here's another example of where the overload tactic comes later. Initially, you're just kind of setting it up. So this makes sense because you're luring the king out, right? And then we have queen to d2 check, which is an example of a fork. So we're combining just luring the king out and going for an attack along with a little fork. And if white tries to defend it, let's just say rook to e2. We have a really nice overload finish here. And it's rook takes f5. And the point, and this is a very clever way to do it, the point is that the queen is overworked, right? If we go back to this position, again, when you see one piece defending two things, there might be a tactic there, right? And that's exactly what we have here. By taking here, white has to make the decision. They either take back, which is no good because then they lose this rook, or they take our queen, but then we take their queen. And at the end of the day, we're up a rook. We have an extra rook, right? And so, again, another version of a kind of a weird looking overload tactic, right? But this is what you have to pay attention for. Okay, so let's finish off with the very difficult puzzle. It is white to play, and keep in mind there's an overload tactic somewhere here, but that's maybe not the only thing going on in the position. You have to look at some other stuff as well. Okay, white to play and win. What should white play? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at this, I'll be completely honest with you guys. I saw part of this when I was trying to solve it, but I didn't see the final blow, okay? And so congratulations if you solved it. You did better than me on this one. So the move is b5 check. And when I was looking at this position, I was noticing like, wait a minute, there's a pawn that can push forward. It's lined up with a bishop. There's a rook lined up. We can push this and get a queen. Like I knew somehow there was something going on with the combination of these moves. I just didn't quite put it together. And here's how it works. b5 check forces the king to either go back or to go over. Now, if it goes back, it's pretty easy for us. We get a queen with check. This is an example of a discovered check. So we move the pawn, but we get the check with the rook, and black is unable to take our queen because they have to get out of the check. So because of that, you can see black doesn't want to go back, which means they have to go sideways. And this is where this is the moment in the puzzle where I was confused. I was like, okay, but what do we do here? Here's the idea. Bishop takes c5 check. We're taking advantage of the fact that this rook is overworked. If the rook takes us to, defend the pawn and take our bishop, it's no longer protecting and we get the queen, which we're happy about. So the rook doesn't want to move. However, the king can take, and this is why I didn't think bishop takes c5 was a good move, because I thought, well, the king just takes. But again, we take advantage of the fact that the rook has to guard this, which means it can't do anything else. And we play the killer move, rook to g5, pinning the rook, attacking the rook, and ultimately black would like to take us. This is what black wants to do, but they can't. We get the queen, and we're going to win. And black actually has no way to deal with this after we play rook g5. Yes, they can take this with their knight, but then we take here with a fork. We're going to win that endgame. And so this was the killer move that ultimately led to the win for white. And so you can see how that overload idea, it was in there. It was in that position, but it was very subtle, right? It was like, okay, what is it? It doesn't even look like this rook is tied down, but it actually is, because it has to stay there guarding the pawn from promoting, okay? And so just wanted to finish off with that sort of tricky variation of this tactic. Extremely common. As you can see, it shows up in lots of different ways. You really have to pay attention, or this one can be easily missed. If you guys are unfamiliar, I have a chess skills tier list, which lists all of these skills that you should learn to become a better chess player, including the overload tactic. I'll put a link in the description below. You can check that out. But it's like 30 years of chess knowledge that I put into a spreadsheet. You can follow along, organize where you're at, what you're learning. And so it's mostly an organizational tool to help you on your chess journey. So if you want to check that out, like I said, links in the description. Thank you guys. See you next time. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.